My father-in-law offered me $100,000 to leave his daughter. She deserves better. I refused. 10 years later, his business was failing. Yesterday, I walked into his office with a check and the recording of our conversation from a decade ago. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who holds on to something for 10 years, but honestly, some wounds just don't heal. I guess I should start at the beginning. I met Elizabeth in my junior year of college. We were both in the computer lab around 2 a.m. Me trying to finish an assignment I'd procrastinated on. Her working on some fancy project for her business class. I probably wouldn't have said anything to her. Social skills aren't exactly my strong suit. But she asked me for help when her program crashed, and I managed to recover her file. The look of relief on her face was worth staying up all night, and somehow we ended up getting breakfast at this 24-hour diner afterward. Elizabeth was way out of my league, probably still is. Smart, gorgeous, confident. The kind of person who walks into a room and everyone notices. Meanwhile, I'm the guy people ask to fix their computers, then forget exists until something else breaks. I guess opposites really do attract, because for some reason, she kept wanting to hang out with me. 2 years later, we were still together, and I was shopping for a ring I could barely afford. Looking back, I should have known something was off the first time I met her father, Milton. Elizabeth had warned me that her family had money, but that was like saying the ocean has water. Their house wasn't just a house. It was an estate with an actual gate and a driveway longer than the street I grew up on. I remember pulling up in my 12-year-old Honda with the mismatched door, college fender bender I couldn't afford to fix properly, and watching the gardener give me directions to the service entrance because he assumed I was delivering something. Maybe I'm wrong, but I swear Milton sized me up in about 2 seconds and decided I wasn't worth the expensive scotch he was drinking. He asked where I was from, and when I mentioned the not-so-great part of town, his eyebrows did this thing, like they were trying to climb up his forehead to escape the conversation. The whole dinner, he kept asking about my career plans in this tone that made it clear he was really asking, "How do you plan to support my daughter on your pathetic salary?" I told him about my job at the tech support desk and my hopes to maybe start my own security consultation business someday. He just nodded and mentioned how Elizabeth's ex was already working at some prestigious firm making 6 figures. To be honest, I wanted to crawl under the table. Elizabeth squeezed my hand under the table and changed the subject, but the damage was done. Over the next year, things actually got worse. Milton would, coincidentally, invite Elizabeth's ex to family functions. He'd email her job listings to pass along to me, all positions that would require moving away from her. During holidays, he'd give Elizabeth extravagant gifts and hand me something generic like a gift card with barely enough to buy lunch. I tried. I really did. I brought flowers for her mom, remembered everyone's birthdays, offered to help around their house when something needed fixing. Nothing worked. I was the stray dog that followed his daughter home, and no amount of tricks would make him see me as worthy. 2 months before our wedding, Milton asked me to meet him at his country club for lunch. I thought maybe this was finally a peace offering, that he was ready to accept me. I actually bought a new shirt for the occasion. Nothing fancy, but at least without the frayed collar my usual work shirts had. I remember feeling so nervous I arrived 30 minutes early and sat in my car, rehearsing things to say. What happened next still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Milton didn't waste time on small talk. He went straight to it. He wanted me gone. He thought Elizabeth was making a huge mistake, throwing away her potential on someone who would hold her back. Then he pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000. He explained the terms like it was a business transaction. Take the money, break off the engagement, and never contact Elizabeth again. He'd help spread a story about me cheating or getting cold feet, so Elizabeth wouldn't try to find me. He even suggested places I could move to with that kind of money, apparently far away from his daughter. The way he talked about it, so calm, so reasonable, made me feel physically sick, like he was discussing buying a car or renovating a bathroom, not buying off the person his daughter wanted to spend her life with. For a second, and I hate admitting this, I actually considered what that money could do for me. I was drowning in student loans. My parents had remortgaged their house to help with my tuition. $100,000 was more money than I'd ever seen, more than I'd probably make in 3 years at my current job. But then I thought about Elizabeth's face when she said yes to my proposal, about how she defended me to her family, about how she believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I didn't take the check, but I didn't tell him off either, which still haunts me. I just mumbled something about needing time to think and walked out, hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice trying to unlock my car. What Milton didn't know was that I'd started recording our conversation on my phone as soon as he mentioned wanting to discuss my relationship with Elizabeth. I don't know why I did it. Some instinct, I guess. Probably all those crime podcasts Elizabeth got me into. I wasn't even sure if it was legal, but something told me I needed protection from whatever was coming. I never told Elizabeth about the offer. Maybe that was wrong of me, but I couldn't bear the thought of her having to choose between her father and me. Or worse, not choosing me. So I kept quiet, saved the recording to multiple places, paranoid IT guy habits, and tried to move forward. Our wedding was small. We paid for most of it ourselves, despite Milton's generous offer to cover everything if we just have it at his country club with his 300 closest friends and business associates. Elizabeth wanted something that felt like us, not a networking event for her father. Milton's toast at our rehearsal dinner is something I'll never forget. He talked about how a father always wants what's best for his daughter, how he hopes someday I'll be able to give Elizabeth the life she deserves, and how sometimes love means sacrificing your own happiness for someone else's future. Everyone else thought it was moving. I heard the real message: you're still not good enough, and someday she'll realize it. The first years of marriage were harder than they should have been. Every family gathering was an exercise in swallowing my pride. Every accomplishment I shared was met with faint praise or comparisons to Elizabeth's cousins or friends who were doing better. When I was laid off during company downsizing, Milton sent Elizabeth links to divorce attorneys. As a joke, supposedly, I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake replaying every condescending comment, every dismissive look, every backhanded compliment. The recording of our lunch meeting became something I'd listen to when Elizabeth was out, reminding myself I wasn't crazy, that the man really did try to buy me off like I was a problem to be solved. Somewhere during those sleepless nights, something changed in me. The hurt calcified into something harder, colder. I started thinking about that meeting differently, not as a humiliation, but as a promise, a $100,000 promise that I wasn't good enough, would never be good enough. And promises, I decided, were meant to be kept. So I started planning, not just a career or a life with Elizabeth, but something else. Something that would take time and patience. Something Milton would never see coming until it was too late. I know this probably makes me sound unhinged, but I swear I'm not. I loved Elizabeth, still do, but I also knew that as long as Milton was there, looking down on me, waiting for me to fail, we'd never really be happy. He'd always be the shadow over our marriage, the doubt in the back of Elizabeth's mind that maybe she should have chosen differently. So I made a decision. I would become successful. Not just comfortable, but successful enough to get Milton's attention. And then, when the time was right, I would cash in that old promise with interest. I just didn't know it would take 10 years, or that when the moment finally came, it would feel both better and worse than I'd imagined. But that's getting ahead of myself. For now, I was just a guy with a wounded ego, a secret recording, and the beginnings of a plan that would change everything. I'll update tomorrow with what happened next. Update. First, thanks for all the comments on my last post. Honestly, I didn't expect so many people to care about my story. To answer the most common question, yes, I'm still with Elizabeth, but our marriage hasn't been easy, and a lot happened in those 10 years between Milton's offer and my revenge. The first 3 years after our wedding were some of the hardest of my life. Milton made sure I felt like an outsider at every family gathering. He'd casually mention how Elizabeth's cousin just bought a vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, then glance at our rental apartment keys on the table. When I got laid off during company downsizing, he sent Elizabeth listings for bigger apartments she could afford on her own salary. These little jabs added up, each one a paper cut to my already bleeding confidence. Elizabeth never saw the worst of it. Milton was smart. He'd wait until she stepped away to twist the knife. I never told her because, well, what would be the point? She loved her dad despite his flaws, and I didn't want to be the guy who came between them. Besides, I probably sounded paranoid. The things he said were always just ambiguous enough that I'd look petty complaining about them. Everything changed when Elizabeth got pregnant with Melissa. I still remember the night she told me. We were eating takeout on our couch, watching some forgotten show when she just blurted it out. I froze with noodles halfway to my mouth. A baby. Our baby. Suddenly, Milton's opinion of me wasn't just about my pride, it was about what kind of father I would be, what kind of life I could provide. That night, after Elizabeth fell asleep, I pulled out my laptop and started researching. If I couldn't get promoted at my dead-end job, I'd have to make my own opportunities. I'd always been good with computers, particularly security stuff, but never had the confidence to strike out on my own. Now I had no choice. I started taking online courses during my lunch breaks and after Elizabeth went to bed. Programming languages, network security, ethical hacking, anything I could get my hands on. I built a home lab with salvaged equipment and practiced until my eyes burned. On weekends, I'd tell Elizabeth I was meeting friends, but would actually be networking at industry meetups, collecting business cards, and making connections. 6 months into Elizabeth's pregnancy, Milton invited us to dinner to discuss the baby's future. He spent the evening explaining how he'd set up a trust fund for his grandchild, with the unspoken implication that he didn't trust me to provide. The final straw came when he offered me a job at his company, an entry-level position that would at least give the baby's father some stability. I'd never felt so humiliated. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that recording from years ago, about how Milton saw me as someone who could be bought. By morning, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just going to prove Milton wrong anymore. I was going to make him regret ever underestimating me. I quit my job the next week. Elizabeth was understandably concerned. We had a baby on the way, after all. But I convinced her I had a plan. I'd been quietly lining up freelance work through contacts I'd made, enough to keep us afloat while I built something bigger. She trusted me, which somehow made me feel both better and worse about what I was planning. Melissa was born a few months later, tiny, perfect, and completely unaware of the war brewing between her father and grandfather. Holding her in the hospital with Elizabeth exhausted but happy beside me, I made 2 promises. I would give this child everything I never had, and I would make Milton pay for trying to keep me from this moment. The next 2 years were a blur of late nights, crying babies, and hustle. I built my business from our spare bedroom, taking any client who would pay me. I specialized in finding security vulnerabilities in companies' systems, legally, with their permission. Turns out, I had a knack for finding weaknesses others missed. The irony wasn't lost on me. As my client list grew, I started noticing something interesting. Many of the businesses I worked with had connections to Milton's company. They'd mention him in passing, or I'd see his name on partnership announcements. The business world in our city was smaller than I'd realized, and Milton's fingers were in many pies. I started keeping notes, nothing illegal, just observations about how Milton operated, who he worked with, what projects he was involved in. I told myself it was market research, but deep down, I knew it was reconnaissance. The real breakthrough came when one of my clients, a small financial firm, asked me to review their security after a partner company experienced a data breach. That partner company? One of Milton's acquisitions. As I dug into their systems, I found something interesting. Evidence of corner cutting, of security measures implemented for show but disabled in practice to save money. I documented everything, added it to my growing file on Milton's business practices, and moved on. But a pattern was emerging. Over the next few years, as my business grew and I worked with more companies in Milton's orbit, I kept finding similar issues. Milton's businesses looked impressive from the outside, but were often held together with duct tape and wishful thinking on the inside. By year 5 of our marriage, things had changed dramatically. My business was thriving. Elizabeth had been promoted at her job, and Melissa was a chatty, curious toddler who had Milton wrapped around her finger. On the surface, even my relationship with Milton had improved. He'd stopped making snide comments, started including me in family discussions, even bragged about his son-in-law's company to friends. I should have been satisfied. I had proven him wrong, built a successful business, given Elizabeth and Melissa a good life. But every time Milton clapped me on the shoulder or introduced me to his golf buddies, all I could hear was his voice from years ago. "She deserves better than you." So I kept digging. I hired people who had left Milton's companies, bought them drinks, and listened to their stories. I took on clients specifically because they competed with Milton, learning how his businesses operated from the outside in. Everything I learned went into my files, not just out of spite, but because someday, somehow, I knew it would be useful. The real turning point came during year 7. The economy took a downturn, and suddenly businesses were cutting corners everywhere. My company actually grew during this time. Security becomes more important when companies are desperate. But I started hearing whispers about Milton's empire, delayed payments to vendors, questionable accounting, loans taken against already leveraged assets. I hadn't planned for this opportunity, but I recognized it immediately. Milton had always been aggressive in his business dealings, expanding quickly and borrowing heavily to fund new acquisitions. In a booming economy, the strategy worked. But when things tighten, those kinds of houses of cards tend to collapse. Around this time, Elizabeth started mentioning her father's strange behavior, mood swings, canceled family dinners, late-night phone calls. She was worried about him but couldn't get straight answers. I listened sympathetically while privately continuing my investigation. What I found shocked even me. Milton hadn't just been cutting corners. He'd been playing fast and loose with regulations for years. Nothing explicitly illegal, maybe, but definitely in the gray area. He'd leveraged the same assets for multiple loans. He'd misrepresented company performance to investors. And most recently, he'd started moving money between his businesses in ways that looked suspiciously like trying to hide financial problems. I spent months verifying everything, collecting evidence, building a complete picture of Milton's business practices. Not because I planned to turn him in, that would hurt Elizabeth and Melissa too. No, I had something more personal in mind. By year 9 of our marriage, my company had become a respected name in the industry. We'd expanded beyond our city, taking on national clients and building a solid reputation. Elizabeth was proud. Melissa thought her dad was a computer superhero. And even Milton had to acknowledge my success. On the surface, our family dynamics were better than ever. But beneath that surface, Milton was drowning. The economic downturn had lasted longer than anyone predicted, and his over-leveraged businesses were struggling. He'd managed to keep up appearances, but I knew from my research that he was running out of financial tricks. He needed capital, and soon, or everything would collapse. I decided it was time. I calculated the exact amount, $100,000 plus 10 years of compound interest at a punishingly high rate, and had my accountant prepare a cashier's check. I dug out the old recording, had it enhanced, and transferred to my phone. Then I waited for the perfect moment. It came sooner than expected. Elizabeth mentioned that her father had canceled their weekly lunch for the 3rd time in a row, claiming he was swamped at the office. She was worried but trying not to show it. I suggested I might stop by his office with some paperwork I needed his signature on. A small lie that still makes me feel guilty, but necessary for what came next. The following morning I put on my best suit, not the off-the-rack ones I wore in college, but a tailored piece that cost more than my entire wardrobe back when Milton first judged me. I tucked the check into my pocket, made sure the recording was ready on my phone, and drove to the gleaming downtown building where Milton's main office occupied the top 3 floors. As I rode the elevator up, I thought about turning back. 10 years is a long time to hold on to anger. I'd built a good life, despite Milton, maybe even partly because of him. Was revenge really worth potentially hurting Elizabeth and Melissa? But then the elevator doors opened, and I saw the sign for Hadley Enterprises, Milton's middle name that he used for his business, and something hardened inside me. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about finally closing a chapter that had been left open for too long. I walked past the receptionist with the confidence of someone who belonged there, straight to Milton's corner office. He'd downsized his staff recently, another bad sign for his financial situation, so there was no assistant outside his door. I knocked once and walked in without waiting for a response. The look on his face when he saw me, confusion, then recognition, then a flash of something like fear, told me everything I needed to know about the state of his empire. Milton Hadley, who had once offered me $100,000 to disappear, was about to learn exactly how much that mistake would cost him. I'll post the final part tomorrow. Things get pretty intense from here, and I need to gather my thoughts about how to explain what happened next. Update 2. The moment I walked into Milton's office, I knew. 10 years of waiting had perfectly aligned for this day. His corner office wasn't what it used to be. The expensive art that once adorned his walls had been replaced with cheaper prints. His desk, previously some imported hardwood monstrosity, was now clearly from a mid-range catalog. Cost-cutting measures that told me everything I needed to know about Hadley Enterprises' current financial situation. Milton looked up from his computer, and I caught that split-second flash of panic before his face settled into his usual mask of superiority. Even now, with his empire crumbling around him, he was trying to maintain the illusion. The bags under his eyes and the half-empty bottle of antacids on his desk told a different story. I didn't wait for an invitation. I sat down across from him and placed my briefcase on his desk. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Me, calm and collected in my tailored suit. Him, tired and confused, but still trying to project authority. Honestly, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He asked why I was there, something about Elizabeth being worried. I ignored his question and took out my phone. Without explanation, I pressed play on the recording I'd preserved for a decade. The quality wasn't perfect. Technology from 10 years ago wasn't great, but his voice came through clearly enough. The color drained from Milton's face as he heard his younger self calmly offering me $100,000 to leave his daughter because she deserved better. I watched every micro-expression cross his face. Shock, embarrassment, then calculation, as he tried to figure out how to spin this. When the recording finished, he started to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. Next, I pulled out a thick folder from my briefcase. Inside was a decade's worth of research on Milton's business practices, tax documents showing discrepancies, email printouts from disgruntled former employees, bank statements highlighting suspicious transfers between his companies, loan applications with contradictory asset valuations. Nothing that would instantly land him in prison, but enough evidence that the right authorities would absolutely launch investigation. As I laid out document after document, Milton's expression shifted from defensive to desperate. He tried interrupting several times, first with anger, then explanation, finally with excuses. I simply continued methodically going through the evidence, pointing out dates, names, amounts, all in the same calm tone you might use to discuss the weather. When I finished with the documents, I pulled out the cashier's check. It was for $235,620, the original $100,000 plus 10 years of compound interest at the rate his own company charged on their loans. I explained that this was what his offer had grown to over the years I'd been waiting. Then I explained my terms. I wasn't just there for revenge. I was there to acquire controlling interest in what remained of Hadley Enterprises. My research showed that Milton needed exactly this amount to prevent his main creditor from calling in their loans that would trigger a cascade of financial collapse. I'd timed everything perfectly, working with inside knowledge of his cash flow problem. Milton's options were simple: accept my offer to buy controlling interest at a fraction of its former value, or watch everything he'd built collapse by the end of the month. If he chose option 2, I'd also ensure that every regulatory body received copies of my documentation. For the first time in our relationship, I saw Milton truly broken, not just worried or annoyed, but fundamentally shattered. The careful image he'd maintained for decades successful businessman, pillar of the community, perfect father, was moments away from complete destruction. He tried appealing to family ties, mentioning Elizabeth and Melissa. I reminded him that he'd been willing to break those same family ties for $100,000 a decade ago. He tried threatening me with lawyers. I reminded him that he couldn't afford good lawyers anymore. I'd checked his recent legal bills. He tried one last tactic, begging the mighty Milton Hadley, begging the worthless son-in-law he'd tried to buy off. I gave him 24 hours to decide, though we both knew he had no real choice. As I packed up my documents and stood to leave, he asked a question that actually surprised me. He wanted to know if Elizabeth knew about any of this. I told him the truth. She didn't. Not about his original offer. Not about my decade of planning. Not about today's meeting. He seemed to take some small comfort in that, which only made what came next more satisfying. Because I wasn't done. Not even close. I informed Milton that my offer had one more condition. He would tell Elizabeth everything himself. The original bribe attempt, his years of undermining our marriage, the financial mismanagement that had brought his company to the brink, all of it. If he didn't, I would. And I had documented evidence to back up every claim. As I walked out of his office, I felt strangely hollow. 10 years of planning, of nurturing resentment, of calculating the perfect revenge. And now it was actually happening. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. The next 48 hours were a blur. Milton signed over controlling interest in his remaining holdings. He tried one last desperate move, calling Elizabeth before our agreed-upon time, telling her a sanitized version of events where I was basically extorting him during financial hardship. Unfortunately for him, I'd anticipated this and had already sent Elizabeth an email with the original recording attached, set to deliver automatically if Milton contacted her before our deadline. Elizabeth's reaction was complex. Hurt, betrayal, anger, but not just at me for keeping secrets. She was furious with her father for trying to buy me off, for lying to her for years, for mismanaging the family business her grandfather had built. Our marriage hit its rockiest period as she processed everything, trying to reconcile the father she thought she knew with the man revealed in that recording and subsequent confessions. Meanwhile, I took control of what remained of Hadley Enterprises. The company was in worse shape than even I had realized. Milton hadn't just been cutting corners, he'd been engaging in increasingly desperate financial maneuvers to maintain appearances. Once I had full access to the books, I found evidence of what amounted to a slow-motion Ponzi scheme, using new investments to pay returns on older ones, while siphoning off capital for personal expenses. I could have tried to save the business. With proper management and an infusion of capital from my own successful company, Hadley Enterprises might have survived in some form. But that wasn't part of my plan. Instead, I systematically dismantled it. I sold off valuable assets to competitors at fair market prices. I helped place talented employees with other firms. I unwound the questionable financial arrangements, making sure all legitimate debts were paid, and investors got whatever could be salvaged from the wreckage. And at each step, I made sure Milton's name was attached to the failure, while I positioned myself as the responsible party trying to clean up his mess. Within 6 months, the Hadley name, once synonymous with success in our city, was irreparably tarnished. Milton's social circle evaporated. His country club membership was quietly not renewed. Charity boards asked him to step down. Former business associates crossed the street to avoid talking to him. The final blow came when Barbara, Milton's wife of 35 years, filed for divorce. She'd apparently been in the dark about the extent of their financial problems and was furious to discover that their supposedly secure retirement was now in jeopardy. The divorce proceedings revealed even more embarrassing details about Milton's business practices and personal spending habits. Throughout all this, I maintained a facade of reluctant involvement, just a son-in-law trying to mitigate the damage from his father-in-law's poor decision. Only Milton knew the truth. Only he understood that every step of his downfall had been orchestrated as payback for that single conversation a decade ago. Elizabeth and I went through months of couples therapy to repair the damage done by my years of secrecy. Melissa, now 10 years old, was kept mostly sheltered from the worst of it, though she couldn't help noticing that visits to Grandpa had become tense and infrequent. My relationship with Elizabeth's mother, Barbara, remained surprisingly cordial. She seemed to blame Milton entirely for the situation, perhaps having harbored her own resentments over the years. As for Milton himself, he ended up moving to a small condo paid for by the money I'd given him for his company shares. The final irony wasn't lost on either of us. He was now living on the exact amount he'd once offered me to disappear. His health deteriorated rapidly after the divorce. The last time I saw him at Melissa's school play, he looked 20 years older than his actual age. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far. If the decade of planning, the methodical dismantling of his life and reputation, was disproportionate to his original sin. After all, I had won before I ever walked into his office that day. I had the successful business, the happy marriage, the beautiful daughter. I had proven him wrong in every way that mattered. But then I remember the look on his face when he offered me that check, the casual certainty that everyone and everything had a price, the absolute conviction that I wasn't good enough for his daughter. And I realized that my revenge wasn't just about the offer itself. It was about the worldview behind it, a worldview that needed to be not just defeated, but destroyed. Was it worth it? The cost to my marriage, to Elizabeth's relationship with her father, to Melissa's relationship with her grandfather? I still don't know. But when I think about that recording, preserved for a decade and finally played back to the man who never thought I'd amount to anything, I can't honestly say I regret it. Because in the end, Milton was right about one thing. Elizabeth did deserve better. Better than a father who thought people could be bought and discarded. Better than a father who valued status over substance. And maybe, just maybe, she deserved a husband who wasn't willing to be pushed around by men like Milton Hadley.